Good evening, YouTube family. Glad to be here once again after about 2 months. My name is Dr. Rome Fraser, and I'm glad to join you on this Tuesday, October 29th, 2024. Have a lot to share. I'm excited. My latest publication is in this work, and I was glad to talk about a scholar who deeply influenced me, and that scholar is C.L.R. James. C.L.R. James is an incredible author. When I first read him, I really didn't understand a lot of what he was saying. It went over my head. And then when I realized that people are individuals and nobody is born a hero, heroes are made, um, I had to reread C.L.R. James. And once I realized that I, in fact, do have the power to change history, I do have the power to influence social thought. That's when I began to really understand the meaning, the deep meaning of the work of C.L.R. James. And his work, The Black Jacobins, deeply influenced me. The history of the Haitian Revolution. Um, Please, if you just joined this, subscribe, like, and share my YouTube. I'm very excited about writing my work and also spreading the ideas of my work. Shout out to Marie Claude Jipweb Akhtar, Associate Professor of Sociology at Howard University, as well as her co-editor, Nazneen Khan, who wrote a brilliant essay on the Kambahi River Collective, the Black feminist statement and movement. Shout out to Nazneen Khan and Marie Claude Jibweb Akhtar for choosing me and my essay to be part of this amazing collection. I'm very proud to be part of it. I'm very grateful to have published yet again this year, 2024. I don't take that for granted. And the piece that I wrote was particularly about the social influence and the thought of CLR. C.L.R. James, as I mentioned, uh, wrote the Black Jacobins, and there's some interesting insights that I wanted to look at. My vision is a little blurry, so I'm going to run and get my glasses and come right back to read the excerpt that I wrote. Stay tuned. Thank you for bearing with me. I wanted to read this excerpt of my article. In his text, Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways, the story of Herman Melville and the world we live in, C.L.R. James describes Herman Melville's 1853 novel. This is what I write. Moby Dick as a cautionary tale about the danger of Western industry trying to control nature. For C.L.R. James, the industry represents the ship that is part of the whaling industry, titled the Pequod, and the giant sperm whale Moby Dick represents. And that whale, that sperm whale, represents nature that is unable to be tamed by industry. This is my whole point. The title of the book comes from the perspective of the first mate or assistant to Captain Ahab, Starbuck, pondering on the individualism in industry. In the fifth chapter of this book that C.L.R. James writes, called Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways, James deals most clearly not with the sense of being radicalized by what one read, as was the case of Toussaint, but with the potential of radicalizing others in Melville's Ishmael character. James sets this chapter up by describing the Pequod as Melville's conversion of the ship into a factory where class conflict emerges. And this, for me, is the exciting part of James' work, as he did with the Haitian Revolution, describing it as a proletarian revolution. He's um, describing the potential of Melville's characters to do the same thing that the Haitian revolutionaries did. At the top of the class order is James's character, or not James, but Melville. This is James describing Herman Melville's fictional character, Ahab, whose fundamental character flaw is what James calls a dictator. Captain Ahab is the most influential character, and he has a huge character flaw in Melville's whole novel. His dictatorial behavior results in the entire crew and ship losing in the final death match against the whale. In terms of class, Captain Ahab is the first mate, Starbuck the second mate, and then the third mate. Below the mates are the harpooners, who are the whales' first contact. James writes how Ahab's job as captain, making the ship owner's profit, morphs into a malicious ambition to capture one single whale that has gained fame and notoriety, named Moby Dick. For C.L.R.James, this ambition turns Captain Ahab into a dictator. The dictator's character poisons all the other characters who are unable to question the dictator, which results in their demise. James describes the younger crew member who was newly hired, Ishmael, as a character with enough knowledge about both the industry and nature to counter Ahab's maniacal desire to kill Moby Dick. However, because of what James calls in his fourth chapter, Ishmael's personal neurosis, he is unable to produce a vast change by thwarting Ahab's ambition, which gets most of the crew killed except Ishmael. What I write later on in this page that you can't see is that James wrote this book, Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways, after being detained on Ellis Island in 1952 under the McCarran Act, administered by government bureaucrats, people who he called government bureaucrats, whom he compares to Melville's dictator Ahab. Um, as in the Black Jacobins, I write, James is calling on his reader to question the propaganda from the mainstream media, specifically that which supports persecutions by the McCarran Act. In his analysis of Moby Dick, each crew member from the top down was unable to lead the workers to question Ahab's logic and his administration, and consequently, there was no leadership of the masses or workers, which resulted in the workers' demise. You can check this article out in this book, 50 Key Scholars in Black Social Thought. There's an interesting entry by Dana Williams about Toni Morrison, an interesting entry by several other scholars, an entry by Akeev Dawson on Angela Davis, and several more. Check this book out, 50 Key Scholars in Black Social Thought. I wanted to share also the books that I came across when I went to the Asala conference. I mentioned that in a previous post. I presented at that conference last month, the end of last month, and I presented a paper on Carter G. Woodson and his articles in Garvey's newspaper, the Negro World newspaper. But I came across a colleague who was highly, highly touted, who was praised when I was at Penn State. Her name is Dr. Anne Marie Mingo, and she is a professor of theology at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. And she wrote an interesting piece, an interesting article excerpt. This book gave me insight on an activist, civil rights activist named Prathia Hall. Um, and this excerpt right here, I pointed out because I was very interested in the dedication she took to leading her church. I'm trying to locate the exact page this is on. If it takes me too long, I'm going to skip it. But I saw Prathia's Hall name so often. I saw it in the book by Claiborne Carson called In Struggle about the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And I was struck by this particular part. This is by Anne Marie Mingo's section called Moral Exemplar, Reverend Dr. Prathia L. Hall, a facilitator of freedom faith. That's a concept that Anne Marie mentions in the earlier part of her book. Mingo writes, entering the South as a young adult, Prathia Hall watched women, men, and children risk their lives for the cause of freedom in ways she had never witnessed before. They marched, she said, in the spirit of Jesus and in the spirit and faith of their ancestors. She recognized that Southern Blacks had often been protesting in silent ways for centuries, including the woman working in kitchens during slavery who spit in food or intentionally broke items in small acts of resistance. As a facilitator of freedom faith, Prathia Hall explained, our job was to draw out and liberate those aspirations to protest injustice. This faith ushered in a belief that God enabled those actively involved in the struggle for freedom to be alive in that particular time and space, to confront and challenge segregation and racial injustice in all of the places it had taken root, including in the hearts of people. From the start of focused direct actions in Albany, Georgia in December 61 until the time Hall arrived in 62, 700 people had been imprisoned for pushing back against the racist system, Mingo writes. She joined Charles Sherrod, the SNCC project director for Southwest Georgia, and quickly became involved in the work. In doing so, Prathia Hall lived out the type of active and socially engaged faith that had been modeled by her parents and intensified by the fearlessness of some Southern Blacks she encountered who understood the potentially dangerous consequences but tapped in to something within to take action nonetheless as a manifestation of their freedom faith. Mingo writes that Hall faced death multiple times while working in Southwest Georgia. As a result, she did not have to wonder, imagine, or take someone else's word for it. She knew that standing up could literally cost you your life. And yet she stepped boldly into the river of Black protest that continued to flow towards justice. River of Black protest is a theme that's going to come up in another book that I bought at ASALA this year. ASALA is the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. They had a conference in Pittsburgh that I was glad to attend last month. Mingo writes that Prathia Hall described the long, cautious, and caring educational exchange that took place between SNCC students and the Black women and men in rural communities, whose very existence revealed lessons on how to live without surrendering humanity or dignity to those who sought to crush them. It was the lesson of faith in the struggle for freedom that Hall took with her in the work she dedicated to her life, to, during, and after the movement. Had some great conversations with individuals, with authors like myself. I was able to share my work to a more positive purpose, which is on my IG, and you can take a look at that. I was grateful also to talk to an author named Pamela Reese Smith, who wrote about somebody that I have always, always wanted to know more about. Um, The individual she wrote about was Francis Lewis Cardozo. Now, Barbara Ransby, in her biography of Paul Robeson's wife, Eslanda Robeson, touched on an ancestor of Eslanda's, who is Francis Lewis Cardozo. And I was so grateful. I meant to take a photo. Ah, I don't believe I did. But Pamela Reese Smith and I had a very powerful, empowering conversation. Like me, she was wondering, what is there exclusively about this man? Because he was a leading figure, and wherever he lived, he was first in South Carolina and then moved to DC. He made space for Black education in the 20th century, sorry, in the 19th century. He made space for Black education, which was not an easy feat to do. So I just wanted to read this excerpt of Pamela's book. I believe I kept the page number. If not, I'll look and I hopefully won't take too much time because the page that really stuck out to me was the page of Francis's DC time. The moment Cardozo stepped foot in the District of Columbia, he was a marked man stripped of his belongings, forced out of his home state, that was South Carolina, blackballed, and a witness to some of the worst examples of white supremacy imaginable. Cardozo fought tirelessly to improve the conditions of his people. Lewis writes, I'm sorry, Reese Smith writes, Pamela Reese Smith writes, tracing his steps in the District of Columbia was not an easy task for Smith, and it will never be complete. What I, Pamela Reese Smith, do know is that he set up shop in the District of Columbia flawlessly. By the way, if you're interested, please subscribe, like, and share my YouTube. Don't hesitate to comment. I'm not able to read comments. I can't, right now I'm streaming live on YouTube. I can't see those comments, but I will respond to them. at the end of this stream message. The sound when I put on the YouTube interferes with the sound of my original source here, so I can't see the comments on YouTube nor on X, where I'm also streaming, nor on Facebook, but please don't hesitate to comment. Pamela Reese Smith writes that what I do know is that he set up shop in the District of Columbia flawlessly. He accepted an appointment with the U.S. Department of Treasury in 1878. While living in the District of Columbia, Cardozo continued the trailblazing work he began in his native South Carolina. Francis Lewis Cardozo was elected as principal of the M Street High School in the northwest quadrant. I was so glad to get a physical copy of this book because it's only at an Asala conference that I can get it. I did not see it online, nor do I see this book in bookstores. She just self-published this, and like myself, she self-published. She wrote a beautiful. She has a very vivid map of South Carolina, where Francis Lewis Cardozo is from, and she has. She wrote a beautiful message to me. Thank you, Pamela. And she has an epigraph by Ralph Ellison. This book was done in 2020. So I plan to complete it because my experience in DC, I think Cardozo's experience will help explain. Um, Pamela Reese Smith writes that um, the M Street High School was one of the first public high schools for African Americans in the United States. Cardozo taught there from 84 to 1896. He ended his 19 years of distinguished service in the public schools of the District of Columbia as principal of the Briggs School shortly before his death. However, Cardozo was not without his critics, most notably W. Calvin Chase, editor of the Washington Bee, who wrote multiple pieces aimed at discrediting Cardozo. I'm just looking for his time in DC. Okay, I'm just locating this page. It's page 113. The bottom of this is tending to get cut off. So I'm going to make sure I just read the page excerpt that I want to read in its entirety by including the end of the page. Calvin Chase wrote multiple pieces against Cardozo. Cardozo was a hero for me because he was a champion of Black education. He was a man who, like Charlotte Fortin, believed in educating those newly emancipated slaves. He was very passionate about it, and he fought vigorously for it. And in the 21st century, we kind of see that legacy eroding with the privatization of public education, with the closing of public schools, with the expansion of charter schools that are privately owned. So this book that Pamela Reese Smith, and then this whole theme of book reading, which is what I wrote in my piece on C.L.R.James. Toussaint became a champion, according to what C.L.R.James wrote, because he was a book reader, because he chose to read a book that his landowner's Jesuit priest friend gave Toussaint. And that influenced Toussaint to think of himself as capable of changing history. And if you listen to the recent interview of Ta-Nehisi Coates by Mark Lamont Hill, Coates says something very powerful in that he comes from a book reading tradition. And I was describing my father, my own father, to someone else. And I had to mention that every house we lived in, we had a library. My father, I also come from a book reading tradition. And one of the biggest mementos that I wish I could have kept before it was thrown out was my father's father building a library. I think there's some photos that are still floating around of that library that my grandfather built for me, my dad, my family when we lived in Florida. So yeah, I come from that book reading tradition, and really the best information, the most detailed information you'll get won't be from a film, won't be from an audiobook. It'll be from a physical book. So we lift up and thank Cardozo for making that kind of book knowledge available to so many South Carolinians. and Black district residents. Two schools in the District of Columbia have been named in Cardozo's honor, Pamela Reese Smith writes. In 1906, an elementary school in the Southwest Quadrant was named Cardozo Elementary School, but was later renamed Randall Junior High. In 1928, a high school in the Northwest Quadrant was named Francis Lewis Cardozo High School, undoubtedly in recognition of the business curriculum he introduced in the M Street High School, which became the foundation of the curriculum at Cardozo High School. Um, so we see his legacy continuing, and we thank Pamela Reese Smith for documenting that legacy in her book. Oh, yeah. Um, I mentioned in a previous post this fascinating history that I'm very open to doing a book club about, and that is Etta Fields Black's book called Combahee, Harriet Tubman, the Combahee River Raid, and Black Freedom during the Civil War. I was so glad to take a selfie with her at the C.L.R. 2024 last month. And I started and finished the foreword, which I found very fascinating. Just want to read an excerpt of the foreword to you. And especially it describes how she came across what she came across. Okay, that's a little blurry for me, so I'm gonna try and read it from the physical copy. I really try and read those photos, but they're so the print is it didn't used to be small. Now it's 45 years old. It's small, so I want to make sure I read it clearly. Um, Starting from the top of that forward, which is Roman numeral 31. She's talking about the people of the Combahee River. This is all about a raid that was part of the Civil War that Harriet Tubman was part of in South Carolina to destroy the Confederacy there and introduce the Union Army. In a sense, in this part of the Civil War, she was a spy. One of the things that Etta Fields Black mentions is that the Union Army did not recognize her as such. But she clearly, from what she has researched, Fields Black, shows Harriet Tubman in this history of her on the Combahee River in South Carolina as a, in fact, spy for the Union Army. Fields Black writes, the overwhelming majority of these people were illiterate and very few left written accounts. Nonetheless, together with the planters' documents, I, Etta Fields Black, will use pension files to reconstruct the enslaved communities and identify those who ran to the Combahee River and got on the U.S. Army gunboats. Partial as it is, this picture reflects the experiences of freedom seekers who escaped during the Combahee River raid and the newly liberated men turned soldiers who freed them, allowing them all to tell the story of the raid in their own words. I, Etta Fields Black, never intended to write a book about Harriet Tubman or about the Civil War, especially not one involving some of my ancestors. My scholarly focus has always been rice, she writes. I've studied peasant farmers who engineered mangrove rice farming technology in the Upper Guinea coast, West Africa, during the pre-colonial period, and enslaved Blacks forced to grow rice on coastal South Carolina's tidal rice plantations. However, Tubman and the Combahee River Raid is a rice story. Indeed, it is one of the best rice stories I have ever come across. As much as possible, I will tell this rice story using sources by and about the Combahee planters impacted by the raid and their family members. After all, this raid didn't happen in Georgetown, on the Santee, or on the Savannah River. It happened on the Combahee, which, with its localized identity and tight-knit enslaved and planter communities. The pension files offer an invaluable window into the tidal rice plantations and enable me, the writer Etta Fields Black, to envision African Americans' lives on these tidal rice plantations before, during, and after the Civil War. The journey, this is the part I underline, the journey to freedom begins by alternating scenes from Harriet Tubman's life, primarily from her biographies, with the lives of the Blacks enslaved on the lower Combahee rice plantations before the Civil War, told through their testimony in the pension files and slave transactions. The intersection of their stories illuminates why Tubman and the formerly enslaved men turned soldiers risked their very lives that others might be free. So that's an incredible work. That's very exciting. That I'm going to get through this first chapter because I haven't come across a history exclusively of that period, 1863 in South Carolina. And one of the stories that Fields Black tells that really makes me want to read it is when she says, Harriet Tubman says of the people in South, mind you, Harriet Tubman from the eastern shore of Maryland, but she says of the people in South Carolina, I couldn't understand them people. And that made me belly laugh because it's like, wow, very different populations, but I'll be interested in seeing how Eddie Fields Black narrates the story. Quite a thick story. Quite a thick story. What is this? 700 pages? 500 pages? But it seems to be worth every page. And I wanted to share before I finish my 40-second YouTube live that I am in the middle of this so-called controversial book, The Message by Ta-Nehisi Coates. Now, I own all of his books, The Beautiful Struggle, Between the World and Me, We Were 8 Years in Power. My baby is making all that noise, and she only does that when I'm on the live. Hi. Thank you for your cooperation, baby. So the message, Mama, thank you. So I'm halfway through it. By the next live, I plan to share my entire response to it. Um, so far, I like it. It reminds me of when I was a freshman and I received my subscription in the mail to Sports Illustrated. He tells the story of being a big fan of a running back and discovering that that running back suffered a concussion and how he got into sports journalism that way, not only by reading the account of the famous running back whose name is escaping me now, but also by the man who caused the concussion, who wrote a different book from a different perspective. And it just gave him um, the idea. I'm wondering now the relationship between that running back and his concussion to colonization, to a group of colonized people who you could say, you could infer from his story and his anecdote about the running back's concussion, you can make a relationship between that and his overall critique of colonization. I found his interview with Mark Lamont Hill the best he's done so far, particularly his point about um, him being told thanks when the people telling him thanks know more about the oppression. They feel the oppression in their bones. I was thinking he was talking about Palestinians, but in certain cases, he's also talking about African Americans here. I happen to disagree with his opinion on the Nat Turner raid that he brings up in that interview. But I highly recommend the message so far, especially for somebody who was born in the late 70s. I believe Coates was born in the middle of the 70s. I was born in the late 70s, but who was affected by sports journalism and who was affected by the athlete. The literary imagination was also affected by certain athletes. For me, certain athletes did that and do that to this day, affect my imagination. Stephen Gardner's running style, LaShawn Merritt's running style affects my imagination. Days, months, years after they run their race, I'm still thinking about their race when I'm doing some random thing like driving or taking a test or writing a book. So I like the way Coates includes athletes into his literary imagination. He does that like no other writer. Halfway through the book, this is my favorite part of the whole book. This is another one where my eyes are seeing blurs. This is on page 146. The best sentence so far in the message is this point he makes on page 148. Journalists claim to be hearing both sides as though a binary opposition had been set down by some disinterested God. But here's the kicker that I think is the best sentence. It is the journalists themselves who are playing God. It is the journalists who decide which sides are legitimate and which are not, which views shall be considered and which pushed out of the frame. And this power is an extension of the power of other curators of the culture, network execs, producers, publishers, whose core job is deciding which stories get told and which do not. When you are erased from the argument and purged from the narrative, you do not exist. Thus, the complex of curators is doing more than setting the pub dates and greenlighting. They are establishing and monitoring a criterion for humanity. And that makes me look forward to reading the second half of the message. Check that book out. All right. Thanks so much for joining me on my 40-second YouTube live. Keep reading and keep the faith.